We've all made I Spy quilts where you take a nice patterned square and you stitch it to the next one and the next one, and then you put frames on or borders on, and you're left with squares. Well, I was left with quite a few squares, and I decided that I didn't want to do the next one square to square, so I had an idea. I was going to frame them with black, but I ended up making a silly mistake, and I cut my black framing 1.5 inches too short. So I wasn't going to waste it, so I added a piece of cream fabric on either side, and it came out with this wonderful pop-out effect. So today I'm going to show you how you can do that with your spare I Spy squares that you've got. It's really simple, and you can just do it a row at a time, and it takes very little time to put together. Hi there, my name's Elizabeth, and I like to sew smart. And today I'm going to show you how to make the pop-out I Spy quilt. Now, the pattern, which is available in my Etsy shop, is for a single bed quilt. It's about 60 by 72 inches, but for the purpose of the demonstration today, I'm going to make a smaller one that would fit a cot, or could be a floor rug for a child. You will need some black homespun fabric, and you'll need some strips cut 5.5 inches wide and some cut 6.5 inches wide. So this is the 5.5, this is the 6.5, and you will also need your background fabric. You will need that cut into 1.5 inch strips. You will pin the 1.5 inch strip to the black fabric and iron it to the dark side. Let's pop that in there. You will also need your I Spy squares, and then you will need some fabric, which you can choose any fabric really, bright and cheerful, for your border. So I had my black strip 5.5 inches, my background strip 1.5 inches, and I have stitched with a 1/4 inch stitch all the way along and pressed it to the dark side. Always press the pale one to the dark side. I've done the same on the 6.5 inch strip. So, and then all you need to do is cross cut these 1.5 inches wide all the way down, and then you will end up with your strips just like that. So here is your I Spy square, 6.5 inches. And I've taken the smaller one, the strip, 5.5 plus the 1.5, but remember I've got a seam allowance there too, and I'm going to stitch it on the bottom, just like this one. So it's stitched along the bottom using a 1/4 inch seam, and then I'm going to take the longer one, the 6.5 plus the 1.5 inches, and I'm going to stitch it to that. On the left hand side it will appear like that, and I'm going to do that all my squares. So when all your squares are done, you will probably have more squares than me, but the thing is that I'm doing 3 across and 4 down for this demonstration. So once I've done all my squares, I'm going to cut my 2.5 inch sashing for the middle, and I'm going to join my line of squares. I've already stitched this one on here, as you can see, all the way along, and I'm going to make my 4 rows, and you will make how many rows you're choosing, to whatever size you're going to make. So I've sewn all my rows together. I've got 3 on my table here and 1 over here because of the space, and I have cut my 2.5 inch sashing from the same background fabric, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stitch a piece of that sashing in between each row. So we'll have that one and this one, and the 4th row will go on after that one. Just stitch them using a 1/4 inch stitch right across, and when you finish, make sure that your edges are nice and square. And once I've done that, I'll come back and show you what the next step is. I am going to put 1 on the bottom and one on the top when I finish. When I cut my strips out, I'm now sewing them on, I actually measured each strip the same. I measured across my line of squares and made it the same length. I did that for a purpose because as I'm stitching, mine happens to be 25.5 inches, but yours will be more. As I'm stitching, using the 1/4 inch foot and the seam allowance, 1/4 inch obviously, when you come nearer to the end, which I will be shortly, you can ease it in. And as you ease it in, you know that your quilt is going to be exactly the same width all the way down. So all I do is stitch right to the end there. So I've stitched on my horizontal sashing. They're all the same length, so I know all the way down now my quilt is exactly the same width. And to do the side pieces, I will have to measure twice through the quilt, through the long side of the quilt. So if I just measure, I have already cut mine, but if I measure, so I have got, yours will be longer than mine, mine's 38.5. And here, again, 38.5. So I know that when I cut my side strips, I've cut 2 of them. They're 38.5 and they will go exactly the length of my quilt. So I pin that on. You may have noticed I didn't pin before. I'm not a big pin user when I'm doing something like this, which is just straight lines, but I would pin on the side pieces before you stitch them. So I've put my outer sashing down that I measured, I've stitched it on, and it's all nicely popping out now. All I'm left to do is to put my border fabric on. And for my border fabric, I like something to actually jump out at you. So I'm cutting, I haven't measured this yet, I'm cutting a 7-inch strip, which will end up obviously 6.5 when you've finished, and I'm going to cut that on the sides first, and that's mainly because I have limited width of this fabric, and it's got, you probably can't see, if you pan in a little bit perhaps, you can see there is a diagonal background line on this, so I'm going to have to be very careful how I cut the top and the bottom, because I like it to look like it's one piece of fabric. So I'm cutting that, measuring again, which I know because we measured for our strips, putting the side borders on first, and then coming back and putting the top and the bottom borders on. And you do it exactly the same way that you did the other sashing, and you'll pin it, stitch it, make sure your corners are square, and then put the top and the bottom on. So I've put on my borders. I've made them wider than I actually will need, quite a bit wider, but I like to quilt first and then cut the borders back. I put them on exactly in the same way that we did the sashing. I did the sides first this time though, and then the top and the bottom to save fabric. And all we've got to do now is choose our binding to go with our quilt. You can have a very good choice for binding fabric because you've got so many colours in your quilt and your squares. So you can either choose one that you've picked for a square, you can pick a blue or a pink if it's for a boy or a girl maybe. I'm going to use probably the white version of my border fabric. So you can use anything, plain, patterned, whatever, it really doesn't matter. And the good thing about this pattern is that's available in my Etsy shop is on one of the pages. On page 2 there is a paste up section, and here there is a little square for your background fabric, your border fabric, your binding fabric and your framing fabric, and that means you can cut it out before you need it beforehand, and you've still or put your fabrics together and you know what you're going to use specifically for any part of your quilt. Now I haven't quilted this yet obviously, but when I do I will cut my backing fabric much bigger than my top quilt and my wadding bigger than my top quilt, and that's because they can shrink up a little bit while you are quilting. So I hope you have fun doing this. If you have enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up and please subscribe. We like sewing with you and making new creations with you, and I hope that you'll really enjoy making this quilt.